Tune.
Don't give up, don't give in. Don't you let the man win. Stand up, be proud. Say it with me, yeah. Say it loud. We will not be idle anymore. We will not be idle anymore.
Say hello, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. As always, it is a pleasure and a bit of an honor to be broadcasting here in New York City and in Washington, D.C. I give my thanks to both WBAI and WPFW for allowing me space on your broadcast grid. As many of you know, we are wrapping up this year with a fund drive, and we're kind of always to some extent in a bit of a fund drive mode because look, we are listener supported radio. We count on your contributions for this station to function, or I'm sorry, for these stations to function. So we do count on your contributions. And WBAI is closing out the year with a fund drive, and WPFW actually is going to have start a fund drive next week. But I'm on both stations, so I'm usually going to pitch for both stations when a show is being shared between the two. So. Um, Again, we can't function without your support, and I cannot be on the air if there's no air to be on. Of course, I know that I could do podcasts and I could do those kinds of things, but there's a value in being broadcast in the broadest sense of the word, on radio in two markets as significant and as important as New York City and Washington D.C. So again, I can't express how much I appreciate having the opportunity to be on WBAI and to be on WPFW. So let me start right from the beginning by asking you to go to your phones or your computers or however you choose to make a donation. If you are listening in New York City on WBAI, I ask that you go to their website, which is buddy.wbai.org. That's buddy.wbai.org. You can become a buddy. You can become a BAI buddy by or a sustaining member of the station by agreeing to make a monthly contribution to the station, and it could be 5, 10, $15, $20 a month, whatever you can afford. And look, the sustaining member or the buddy program is one that is actually kind of trying to cater to the fact that we know that we're all struggling at times with whether we're paying for streaming services or whatever our bills may be. But this is a way to budget, and we can get you with a commitment to make a certain contribution per month, and then we're gonna tally it up as over the course of a year, and what may only seem like $10 a month to you turns out to be $120 a year for us. So that's why we look at it this way, and we encourage you to become a sustaining member of both WBAI and WPFW. Again, if you want to do so with WBAI, you go on their website, which is buddy.wbai.org, or you can call 1-833 WBAI NYC, or the numbers are 1-833 922 96, or I'm sorry, let me say it again, 1-833-922-4692, and that's the number to call to speak to an operator. Look, and if for whatever reason, if you get an answering machine, just leave your number and your name, and somebody will get right back to you. I don't know how, Reggie. I don't know if you've got an idea how we're doing with this fund drive this so far this as we close out the year. I know we got off to a pretty good start.
Well, I mean, it's funny you should mention that because I was just about to go and check right about now. So if you give me a second, I will tell you. And right now, we're at $55,194 out of $150,000, which means that we're at 37% of the goal. And considering that it is December 12th, and we need to make this before December 31st. It seems like we're in a pretty good pace.
It's good, but it's not enough. I mean, and I'm going to say this. Look,
Oh, certainly. I mean,
because here's the
no
thing,
doubt.
we've got a couple of weeks before the holidays really kick in, and the likelihood of us being able to generate the kind of revenue that we need um, on look, I'm going to do the show on Christmas Day and then on New Year's Day, and of course by New Year's Day the drive is over. So I've got this week and I got next week, as far as I go, um, without the distraction of the holiday. So we've got work to do. So I asked that, and look, I get asked all the time. Reggie, we've had callers call in, and they've asked. They said, "Hey, John, what can we do to help the native cause?" Well, I'll tell you, one of the things you can do is keep the native guy on the radio. I mean, it's just the bottom line. If you, This is the opportunity for a voice to be heard that isn't being heard anywhere else. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit today during the show here about the silencing of voices and the erasure that Native people experience because it happens every single day. But WBAI and WPFW give us an opportunity to you know to have a Native voice be heard above or at least on the level with the other noise that's out there. Look, nobody's going to prioritize my voice over some of the other talking heads on the news or on the radio or even podcasts. I'm just one of them. But at least I am one of them. And at least WBAI and WPFW give me the opportunity. So again, if you're listening in New York, I'm asking that you go to the website, and it's again buddy.wbai. That's buddy.wbai.org. Follow the prompts and either do a one-time donation or become an actual buddy to the program. Do it in the name of Resistance Radio, and I will greatly appreciate it. You can call, and that number is 1-833-922-4692. If you're listening in Washington, if you're catching this show on Friday on WPFW, then I ask that you go to their website, which is WPFWFM.org, or their number is 202-588-9739, or their 800 number, which is 1-800-222-9739. And the same thing goes there. Follow the prompts. Follow the operator who will take your call. Become a sustaining member by doing something that's a once a month. Treat us almost like a streaming service, one that you're not bound to, but that we ask that you make a commitment. You make a commitment to these stations, not just to keep Resistance Radio on the air, but to keep all the great programming that exists on these stations. And look, we know that with the Trump administration basically killing the Corporation for Public Broadcast, all of those other stations that were getting millions of dollars, and I don't mean just stations. I mean, we've listened to people who produce documentaries and all these other things. All that money's gone away. So there's a whole lot of people that are going to be asking for your dollars. And of course, we're among them, and we've been asking all along because you are our sole support. We rely on you solely to keep this station afloat. We haven't been receiving any kind of federal funding or that kind of funding in many years. So we've relied on you. But I know that there's going to be an awful lot of other people pulling at your pockets here. So again, don't sacrifice us to those others. If you can support public broadcasting generally, then by all means do so. But we still represent a solidly independent voice on for all of our Pacifica stations, but for the two that I am broadcasting on, it is a rare and almost exclusive opportunity for a Native voice to be heard in this manner. So, look, and here's what I'm going to do. We are kind of closing out the year. We've got again, we got this week and next week before the holiday, just kind of overruns us. And yes, I will have a show available on Christmas Day. I don't know how many of you will be available on Christmas Day to check out the show, but I will still be doing a show. And no, it won't be Christmas carols, and I won't be pitching Amazon Prime or anything like that. So, no, I won't be doing any of that. But here's what I want to do today. I want to spend today talking a little bit about the year in the past. I'm looking back over what's happened, and there's some things that are still happening. This past week, a judge threw out the appeal by the Massapequa School District. For those of you who know that I've been involved in the mascot issue. Massapequa out in Long Island has been fighting against the New York State Education Department, um, uh, trying to resist the ban on the use of native mascots by high schools, and they had been suing the Board of Regents and suing the Department of Education, and they lost, and then they had an appeal. This latest appeal is kind of interesting, and it actually makes me feel a little bit good, because what these guys tried to do is they tried to enter into some sort of unholy relationship with this group of frauds. They call themselves the Native American Guardians Association. And so when they launched this appeal, they not only appealed the previous ruling, which basically said, look, you don't even have standing. And they were talking about the school board in the first place, that they don't have standing because they are not an injured party. So there's a whole lot of, I mean, for most people who think you can just go into court and sue, no, you have to have standing. You have to have a legal basis to be a plaintiff in a case. And basically the court said, no, you don't even have standing. So then they claim to have entered into a contract with the Native American Guardians Association. And I don't know what the Guardians Association was supposed to be providing them in terms of a service, but among the things that they claimed they were providing them was permission to call themselves the Chiefs. Now it's an absurd proposition to suggest that the Native American Guardians Association had some sort of ownership over that name or the imagery, but this is what they attempted to do. And here's what the court said. Basically, the court called this group NAGA, Native American Guardians Association. They basically called them out on fraud. And he said, look, you guys didn't have a contract. This was an illusion. It was an illusory, that's what they called it, an illusory arrangement. There was nothing, you had no contract with them. So the idea that you're trying to enter in as a plaintiff in this case because you're an injured party, you have actually less standing than the school board did. So basically the court just threw it out. The only thing the court did say was there could still be an argument about freedom of speech, but only if the one person who used to be on the school board brings that case, because she would be the only one that could possibly have standing. But it wouldn't hold up in court anyway, because nobody's saying you can't use the word. Nobody's even saying you can't call yourself a chief or the N word or the R word or anything else. You could do all that stuff. It's inappropriate. All they're saying is that the school can't, this state-funded and partially federally funded organization cannot use that name to promote itself. That's all they said. They say, look, there are individuals in that district who, if they want to call themselves whatever they want to call themselves, there's no law that prohibits it. Look, just to remind people, there's no law against blackface. People just don't do it. Well, I'm not saying people haven't done it, and plenty of people have, and may perhaps still do, but nobody considers it appropriate. You didn't need to have a law that says it's you can't do it. And frankly, I don't even think there has to be a ban in a school that prohibits blackface. I think it just goes without saying that a school would not allow, kids to go into a school wearing blackface, claiming to be black people because or for whatever reason. But again, sometimes I think reason goes out the window. So the good news is this week is once again a court has thrown out the fight by the Massapequa School District against the ban on the use of native mascots by schools. So, but I will say, these guys have vowed to keep going. They vowed to keep fighting, and of course, let's not forget that they have the support of the Trump administration. Linda McMahon, the wrestling lady who is the Secretary of Education. Yeah, don't try to make that make sense. It won't. It just won't make any sense. But here's the thing. Another aside, I don't know if anybody saw this, but they one part of the I guess the House passed the appropriations bill for military spending, and what they did is they buried in that bill on funding the military a forced recognition of a group of Native people that called themselves the Lumbee. Now, just to be clear, there is no such thing as a nation or even a tribe. There are no peoples that are actually legitimately a group that can be identified as the Lumbee. Lumbee is a made-up term. For those of you who don't know, and if you wonder why does John Kane hate those Lumbees? Look, I don't hate the people. Most of those people are native, but they're not Lumbees. Lumbee is a made-up term. It's actually was meant to be a pejorative slang term. It's what the native people who lived along the Lumber River in North Carolina, they were called in a pejorative and slang term. Oh yeah, those Lumbees, those Indians who live along the Lumber River. That's where the word comes from. It's not even coming from a native word for the river. The river was actually renamed by white folks, and then they took a slang version of the river, and that's what they called the native people. Now, the reason that native people have opposed this federal recognition is twofold. One, there is a standard that the Interior Department has for federal recognition. Now, and let me say right from the beginning, I oppose federal recognition because of what it is. It's basically a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. That's what federal recognition is. I call it Fed Rec, and that's the reason I do. But they do have a standard, and part of the standard says, well, you have to be an original people, and you have to have a language, you have to have a culture, you have to have a history. The problem is, those who have called themselves Lumbees or who were referred to as Lumbees were already native peoples of other nations. They already had, and primarily Tuscarora. But the Tuscarora are not federally, I don't even think they're state recognized. And the Tuscarora, many of whom came up to live amongst the five nations to make us the six nations up here. We have a Tuscarora community up here in what is considered Western New York. But many Tuscarora stayed, and some of them were referred to as Lumbees, and now they viewed themselves as having an opportunity to become recognized as Lumbees. So they really pandered to Trump big time, and they got Trump's support for recognition, even though the Interior Department says, look, they don't qualify. They just don't qualify. In fact, I listened to native people, a couple of congressmen say, well, there's two ways for federal recognition, through the Interior Department and through an act of Congress. So they just kind of jammed this into a military appropriations bill. And I bring this up because as I look at the frauds that this group that calls themselves the Guardians Association, I'm just waiting for them to somehow petition Trump to be recognized as a distinct tribe all by themselves. They'll call themselves the Noggins or something. I don't know what the hell they call themselves. But, I mean, they have no standing anywhere. There's not a single native territory that recognizes them. And I will say that the Lumbees don't have a whole lot of support within the broader picture of native communities because we've all come to recognize that it's a bit of a debacle for them to claim this identity that was made up by a slang term from white folks. I mean, and look, don't get me wrong. There are many native peoples whose nations have been altered in terms of what we are called. But we don't try to be distinct from who we are originally, and that's what's happening here with this. But anyway, I mentioned the Lumbee because it's in the process. I think the Senate has to approve this thing, and then the Lumbee are going to be considered a federally recognized tribe of the United States. Even if they're not recognized by any other native peoples, they're going to be recognized by Donald Trump through this appropriations bill. Just kind of craziness. But I couldn't help but think, as I'm watching NAGA be classified as frauds by this judge, that I could see them trying to do the same thing that even though they don't really have any people, but um, I could see them trying to do the same thing. So anyway, one final thing on the mascot thing, I gotta make it, make this one statement. If I'm wrong, and I hope that I am, but I don't believe a single state has joined the 8 or 9 states that currently have banned the use of native mascots. I don't think another state has joined since Trump was elected. I mean, and I hope I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. And that gives you an idea that the influence that Trump has had, because there are states that are in the process, and I know that and some are working towards that. But a couple of these bills that have gone through state legislatures have been scuttled or at least put off. But I think part of the whole war on wokeism and DEI and all of this stuff that Trump hangs on is part of the reason. So yeah, I don't believe a single state has joined the 8 or 9 thus far, including New York and obviously several others. But there was a clear trend. State after state was doing this, and then it's come to a screeching halt with Donald Trump. So I'm not going to dismiss the influence that this guy or his moron of a secretary, education secretary, has had, because it's clearly had an effect. And I'm not saying that the reason these things have died are solely because of Trump, because let's be clear. Part of the reason I took the mascot fight to the Department of Education rather than going through the New York State legislature was because this whole idea of pandering to a base, to the extent, because getting elected is the primary goal of any elected official. The first thing they do is begin to campaign for the next election, raise money, get reelected. So if they're going to ostracize anybody over something that they don't think is important to them, like the mascot issue, they're not going to take that chance. So I knew trying to push a bill and there had been one languishing in the New York State legislature for many, many years. I knew that it was that was going to be a futile exercise, but I felt like, give me some people who are a little less political, that are dependent on pandering to a political base to stay in the position. Give me people who have more of a commitment towards children, towards the education of children. And that's why I landed on the New York State Department of Education. And again, I'm proud of the work that Dr. Betty Rosa did, both in picking up the conflict over with my old high school, Cambridge Central School, and ruling against Cambridge. I'm glad that she did what she did, and I'm glad she took it to the next level and said, yes, not only am I going to tell Cambridge they have to get rid of their native mascot, I'm telling all schools they have to do it. She followed through on what a previous commissioner 20 years prior had done. So, but anyway, that's all I'm going to say. That's kind of the year in review a little bit on the mascot issue. Although I will say that I was disappointed in how Letitia James negotiated a settlement with Connecticut to allow them to keep calling themselves the T-Birds, as if somebody doesn't know that T-Birds means Thunderbirds. But yeah, that was a terrible deal, and she kind of threw the Department of Education under a bus with that one, because she actually is the one who has the legal authority to enter into these agreements. And that's what she had done. So, but anyway, that's the kind of final note on that. Here's one thing that I definitely want to address, and look, we've been listening to this all year long, and actually going back obviously several years. But look, the atrocities that are taking place, not just in Gaza, but the atrocities that the Palestinian people have endured at the hands of Israel, is well documented on these stations. And there's no question about that. We know what it is. Here's the issue that I have. Because I saw a recent post that somehow called, suggested that the myth of freedom and democracy died in Gaza. I'm sorry, the myth of freedom and democracy represented by the West, by the United States in particular, has died in Gaza. And here's the problem I have with that statement. How did 500 years of slavery and genocide not kill that myth already? And by making a statement like that, and I just got into it, I mixed it up a little bit on Facebook when I saw this post. Because I understand the sign, I understand the banner, and I understand the sentiment. That yes, there is more than just children and elderly and innocent people dying in Palestine. I know that. But to suggest that along with that, the myth of freedom and democracy represented by the West, by any of Western cultures, is died there. Look, Native people have experienced 500 years of genocide, slave enslavement of Africa has been going on for 500 years. So to suggest that somehow only this current level of atrocities being committed by Israel is proof that the United States is a myth when it comes to freedom and democracy. It's always been a myth. And the problem that I have is I feel like without mentioning us on a continuous basis, right alongside the atrocities that are happening throughout the world against indigenous peoples, if you're going to ignore us, what you're saying happened to us was okay. You're erasing 500 years of atrocities that have never been accounted for, nobody's ever been held responsible for it. So while I'm not condemning I'm not trying to throw any shade on the struggles of Palestinian people, I'm not at all. I'm saying we're with you. But we are with you. We've experienced the same thing for actually a longer period of time. Yeah, the Jews can claim that they've experienced atrocities for thousands of years. Well, you know what? Most of you were based in Europe. You weren't in your homelands you were not being persecuted as indigenous people. Maybe you were being persecuted. I'm not suggesting that the Holocaust wasn't real. But let's be truthful here. There's been an American Holocaust that has been in the process for over 500 years. So my plea to the Palestinians is that even in your struggle, and I'm not saying I'm not asking for prayers, I'm not asking for money, I'm not asking for anything, but keep in mind, there are other people who've gone through, who are still going through in many ways what you're going through. So as the rest of the world hoists up their pro-Palestinian flags, and by all means do so, let's not ignore the fact that Native people have gone through this thing and are going through this thing. So I want to bring that up. Of course, I just look in the process of promoting our film, The Long Hope, which really kind of chronicles the overt racist legal doctrines that are basically responsible for much of what Native people have experienced in terms of genocide and frankly, by talking about the doctrine of Christian discovery, we're talking about slavery as well. But in the process of promoting our film, which we are going to do in a big way entering into the new year. Look, we finished it this past year. Our film came out in the latter part of the year. We've done a bunch of screenings, and we're going to do more, including in New York and in Washington and other places. So we are taking this film on the road. But one of the things that we've met up with is a certain amount of resistance. And I've talked about this a couple of times on the show already. But I read an interesting piece. It was done by Maggie Blackhawk. And the piece was referring to the Constitution of Colonialism. And she didn't mean a written constitution like the U.S. Constitution. What she was talking about is how colonialism was constituted. But what she talks about, she actually juxtaposes this idea of constituting colonialism or imperialism set against the U.S. Constitution. And what she basically makes in this piece that she wrote, this article she wrote, was that the Constitution of colonialism is like an outward expression of violence and tyranny against other people, Native people in particular. While the U.S. Constitution is an inward-looking system that she claims was about protecting the people. So the written Constitution is about protecting the rights of those covered by the Constitution. But the actual rules and the constitution of colonialism is anything but. That it's about violence, it's about genocide, and where, well, I'm glad she wrote much of what she wrote. What I was left with when I finished reading the whole article was her desire to somehow include those people who were violated by that constituting of colonialism, to somehow be regarded among we the people under the U.S. Constitution. So how do you take a people who have been pegged as the enemy, and who have withstood 500 years of genocide and tyranny and slavery and all this other stuff, and all of a sudden say, okay, now we're going to protect you? And see, this is the conflict that I run into with what we're promoting in our film. Because what I'm calling for in our film, and what Ross and others who are involved in our film are calling for, is dismantling the notion of being regarded as wards of the federal government. And dismantling the plenary powers doctrine. And I got to tell you, within Native territories, we are hearing it over and over again, that there's a concern that in the absence of Congress having ultimate authority over our lives, who would? Because for some reason, many of our own people can't fathom the idea that we would control our own destiny, that we could actually be a free and independent people. They can't even begin to understand that. So the automatic assumption is, in the absence of the federal government, Congress having authority over us, that we would be left at the hands of the states. And we know that would not be a good thing. Look, don't get me wrong, I know that having 50 different, oftentimes conflicting and varying degrees of tyranny being waged against Native peoples, in spite of our connection with each other, would be hell. And so I understand the concern if somehow the authority of states were elevated above the authority of the federal government, and certainly to be held above us. But that's not what I'm fighting for. I'm not fighting to replace the tyranny of the federal government with the tyranny of the states. So, but I think it's interesting to talk about this, and I encourage people to look at this piece that was written by Maggie Blackhawk. Her husband Ned Blackhawk also has written on the subjects, and I find what some of these guys are suggesting is a real fear about that house of cards collapsing. One of the statements that she says in this piece was that in the absence of plenary powers, the entire USC 25, that section of U.S. law, would be obliterated. Well, yeah, it might. And with it goes away a lot of tyranny. Now, but the problem is many of our people still think that they were protected by some of this stuff. So this is the challenge that I have going forward in the upcoming year, especially as we promote our film. So I wanted to mention those two things. All right, we have some other historical stuff. I mean, Reggie, as you know, it was, let me take a break before I even get there. Let me once again remind people, we are listener-supported radio. We count on your support for these stations, both WPFW in Washington, D.C. and WBAI in New York City, to exist. We don't exist without you. We are literally your radio station. You, the listening audience, we are your radio station. Look, even if you haven't contributed in the past, we still do this for you. If you're listening, we do this work for you. We only hope that those of you who can will give us something back. We'll make a donation to WBAI or WPFW. And look, I would love it if you would do it in the name of Resistance Radio. That's my hope. My hope is that by listening to some of the things that we talk about on this show and the other station, the other programs talk about, that you will feel convinced and coerced, perhaps, into supporting these radio stations. And so I ask that you go to WBAI's website, which is buddy.wbai.org. That's buddy.wbai.org, and make either a monthly contribution and become a buddy to WBAI and Resistance Radio, or that you make a one-time donation. That you figure that you work out some means within your budget to support this radio station. If you're listening in Washington D.C. on WPFW, I hope that you'll go to their website, which is WPFW-FM. That's WPFW-FM.org, and do the same thing. Become a sustaining member, become a one-time donor, but do what you can to support these stations. And of course, the numbers again. Let me go back to WBAI. The number to call is 833-922-4692. That's 1-833-922-4692. And again, if in calling that number you get an answer machine, just leave your name and your phone number and somebody will go back to you. You don't have to leave any other information. Just leave contact information for somebody to get back a hold of you, and then we'll run you through the process to make you an official member of the station. If you're listening in Washington, and you would rather do it by phone rather than going online to WPFWFM.org, then I ask that you call 202-588-9739 or their 800 number, which is 1-800-222-9739, and support these fine radio stations. And thank them. Thank them for giving me space on their broadcast grid. Thank them for giving me the opportunity to share some of what I share. Now look, some of what I do here is not just about Native stuff. Now, although there's always going to be a Native connection. I mean, there was this past week there was the commemoration of the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. Now, obviously, I have a whole lot of mixed feelings about what happened then, and part of the reason is that the United States was sitting in an illegal occupation of Hawaii at the time of this bombing. They stole the land. They illegally occupied not just the Kingdom of Hawaii, but the entire landmass, and then built up their military-industrial complex there, threatening in many ways the growth of the military-industrial complex of Japan, to the point where it exploded, and Japan bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor. But I want to remind people that not only was the United States, did they not only use Pearl Harbor initially to illegally occupy Hawaii, but they built it up into this massive military presence there. And when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, they didn't bomb the cities. They didn't bomb Honolulu. They didn't bomb any other place but the military base, but the naval yards. However, when the United States responded to this day of infamy, they dropped 2 atomic bombs on civilian populations in Japan. And they did it at a time when the war was essentially already over. It was intended to be the crushing blow that would be enough to convince those belligerent Japanese officials who wanted to continue to fight a losing war. But by dropping 2 atomic bombs, the only nuclear weapons ever put into real life or real death military service, was the United States committing this atrocity against civilian populations in Japan. So I don't think that it's even fair to mention Pearl Harbor without mentioning what the United States did in retaliation. And look, if you're a patriotic American and you think that was justified, just remember that the most devastating thing that came out of World War II was the nuclear arms race. It's what looms over all of us every single day. And only one country stooped so low as to drop nuclear weapons upon civilian populations. Millions of people died. Millions. In an instant. No, I take it back. Some of them took years to die because of the cancer and the illness that was caused by the radiation. So, while some of you want to reflect on the atrocity that Japan waged on Pearl Harbor in a military strike, and you want to sing the praises of the United States in, you know, in their victory of World War II, just know what they did, and just know what a true and genuine atrocity it was for the United States to drop 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I had to mention that. And again, the only real native connection here is the fact that I still have friends to this day who are fighting to reestablish and to assert, not even reestablish, because many of them claim, and justifiably so, that the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists, in spite of their lands being illegally occupied. And make no mistake about it, what the United States did was illegal. Even their claim to annexation of the Hawaiian Kingdom was illegal. They didn't do it through their own process. They didn't negotiate. There was no annexation treaty that was signed by the President of the United States and confirmed by 2/3 of the Senate. No, there was no such thing. There was no annexation treaty. It was a coup by a bunch of white men that ultimately resulted not in the legitimate process of taking land in by the United States. And yeah, I could argue about how legitimate that process was. But there was no annexation. It was all done through a joint resolution of Congress, which essentially has no force of law. You know, there are laws and then there are resolutions. And the courts have said over and over and over again that a resolution by Congress is not the same. It does not have the same force of law. And here's the difference. A joint resolution of Congress only needs a simple majority. But to approve an annexation treaty, which there wasn't even one, that required 2/3 of the Senate to advise and consent with the president. So the process was even illegal. And of course, the Hawaiian people always rejected this from day one, right up until the day that the United States declared it a state. So, yeah, at the end of the day, even Pearl Harbor has a significant native story associated with it. So my hat goes off to those patriots of the Hawaiian Kingdom who are still fighting every day to force the rest of the world that recognized them, by the way, at one time as an independent nation, to continue to recognize them. So, you know, I applaud the work of those Hawaiians, those Kanaka Maoli, who are still fighting to restore to its full, you know, its fullness, the Kingdom of Hawaii. So I wanted to mention that. Of course, I can't get through this program without talking about Venezuela. You know, and I know you're getting the news reports, and you know that the United States has just committed piracy on the open seas by stealing an oil tanker from the Venezuelan country, from the country of Venezuela. Here's the thing that I have to say about this, and again, there is a Native part of this thing too. As many of you know, Native people still to this day, as much as I rail against it, still to this day, Native people enlist in the U.S. military at a very high rate, a higher rate than any other group within the United States. And part of it is because of the abject poverty that so many of our territories exist in, and the limited opportunities that our people have within our territories. Yeah, I know many of you think, oh yeah, we're all just rich because we all have casinos. Let me remind people that we are not. Most of the revenue that comes in from gaming results in an annual budget less than an average school district. So get off of that whole idea that we're all living large off of gaming. Yeah, some places have done pretty well, especially places that have a really, really small population, but a rather successful gaming operation. and I don't need to get into who has done well and who hasn't done well. But let me say the vast majority of native territories, with or without gaming, still has a significant portion of their population living at or below the poverty line. So let me just say that. And that's part of the reason that native people enlist in the military. Look, on our territories, poverty has been a forced policy. The We lead in all the categories you don't want to lead in, including corruption of government. And part of that is because it's the federal government that empowers these guys, not our own people. But we lead in suicide and substance abuse and teen pregnancy and dropout rates and unemployment, the lowest death rate. Look, all of life expectancy is lower on our territory than any place else, and it's not even close. The prospect of a woman or a girl being raped is 5 times higher for Native women than any place else in the United States. So, and let me be clear, the vast majority of those crimes are done by white people. I'm not saying that Native people aren't responsible for some of the domestic violence and some of the sexual assault. They are. But it's like 30% versus 70%. So this is what life on Native territory is like. So when a young man or woman, because now women are enlisting at a fairly high rate too, see the military as a place that they can go to where there's going to be some honor in it, but then get deployed in a situation like what's brewing with Venezuela. And the first instinct, I think, is for people to say, "Oh, I hope our loved ones aren't going to be at risk. I hope that the young men and women from our territory who may or may not be deployed on the ground in Venezuela. Certainly they're there. I think there's like 15,000 Marines that are in the Caribbean right now. And now they're committing acts of piracy. Not only are they committing murder, and I'm not saying the Marines are doing it, the military in general is doing it, but somebody's hands are on the trigger. Somebody's deploying those drones. Somebody's actually doing this work. And it isn't Donald Trump in Washington or the drunk guy who leads the military. No, it's not those guys. It's people who are being used. And while I am concerned about the risk to the lives of our young Native people who find themselves in this situation, I understand that the superior weaponry and all the resources and everything else put them at an incredible advantage over the people of Venezuela. Not to say that their lives aren't going to be at risk, but here's what the real thing is at risk. And I can't downplay this. So I want everybody to consider this. Because we know the PTSD that came after Vietnam and some of the other conflicts the United States has been involved with. But consider the young Native man who's being called upon to pull the trigger, whether it's on a drone or whether it's on a rifle, to murder somebody who is not their enemy, but somebody who's defending their country from an invasion. Because at some point, whether our children have their lives at risk or whether they suffer some physical injury or not, or worse yet, lose their lives, some are going to survive this without any physical injury, without any death, except for the ones on their hands. So at some point, the guy pulling the trigger, or the girl pulling the trigger, because it could be that too, the individual, native or non-native, they're going to have to live with this idea that they were just following orders. And perhaps they do go through with it. Perhaps they do. And we're seeing boat after boat. There's been almost 100 people that have been killed that were no threat to the United States whatsoever. Even if they were running drugs, they They didn't even have the vehicles that could have gotten the drugs to the United States. So the whole thing is an absurd proposition. Somebody pulled the trigger to kill those people. Whether they pulled it on a missile or a drone or whatever it was, somebody in the military took those lives. And they were following orders from above them. So, to the young men and women who are going to be called upon to pull the triggers on innocent people, oftentimes native people, indigenous people in Venezuela, to those young men and women, native and non-native, who are going to be called upon to do that, just know that they're going to have to live with the trauma of what they've done. And the excuse of just following orders is not going to make that go away. The psychological harm that will be incurred upon those individuals, because some of those guys aren't bad. Look, I know people today, right now. I know some of the families who have members of their family in the military today, right now. And some of those families are friends of mine. And I just hope that those young men and women never have to pull a trigger. Of course, I hope they aren't harmed. Of course, I hope they aren't killed. But I also hope they don't have to kill. Or when placed in a situation, that they defy those orders. I'll leave it there. I want to remind people that we are listener-supported radio. And I know, I suspect you haven't heard some of what I had to say today. Reggie, I don't know, what the other shows have talked about, but I suspect that nobody's talked about this kind of harm that may befall the people who are just following orders. So,
well, definitely a perspective that is distinct and is part of your brand. And let me just say, John, the United States taking something that doesn't belong to them, that's a new phenomenon.
That's what I was talking about with Palestine, right? Anybody who thinks that all this stuff is new, it's been going on. Where do you think the gold went from the Black Hills?
That.
Come on.
I've never experienced that. Wow, this is so weird.
So, look, I want to thank people for tuning me in. And I know, look, some of what I talk about is uncomfortable, folks. But we have to consider this stuff. So I want to thank you all for listening to this program. And I want to thank you for those who have contributed to WBAI and WPFW. I want to thank you. And for those pondering it, I want to encourage you to do so. Please do support WBAI and WPFW. Support these stations that give me the space and give you the opportunity to hear me in this space. I can't thank these stations enough. I think the idea of being on the air in Washington and New York is incredibly important. But keep in mind, the show does get put up as a podcast. It gets put up as a Facebook video. It gets put up as a YouTube video. So even if you're not catching this live, there's a good chance you're going to have the opportunity to hear what I've had to say or see me for that matter. But regardless of how you catch this program, whether you catch it on the radio in Washington or New York City, I hope that you'll support these two radio stations. And to any of the affiliates, the Pacifica affiliates that carry this show, and I know there's some of you out there, again, I hope that you get the support that you need to keep airing this program as well. I want to thank you once again for listening to this program. Look, we are wrapping up this year, and I'm going to do more of this kind of year in review stuff as we close out these final days, for me anyway, final days, because even though it's final weeks, it's only final days for me. So I want to thank you for tuning me in, and I look forward to being right back here next week. I am John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me on the air. Yahweh.